Thank you, Terry, for that very kind introduction. Admiral, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here at the Naval War College and to share some thoughts with you about the rise of China. China has, Terry, I should say, has, of course, given me a very difficult assignment, and that is to talk about so complex a subject in a relatively short period of time. So what I want to do is to lay out some general ideas, a broad framework for understanding where China has come from and where it seems to be going. And then I welcome your questions and your comments once I finish my prepared remarks. The title of my presentation today, Beyond Wealth and Power, refers to the traditional objective of China as it first encountered the West. In the mid and then ultimately the late 1800s, when for the first time in its history it encountered nations that were technologically superior to China. Before China had been invaded, it had been conquered by a variety of neighboring peoples, everybody from the Mongols to the Manchus and others as well. But basically Chinese had been confident in the assumption that whatever the temporary technological inferiority of China, especially with regard to military capability, that underlying that immediate and shorter term technological inferiority, Chinese culture and China's underlying civilization was the most important in all of East Asia. And the coming of the West, beginning in the late 1700s and then the early 1800s and throughout that century and beyond, challenged China in a way that it had not been challenged before. And so Chinese officials and Chinese intellectuals defined their national objective as the search for wealth and power. In Chinese, and I know some of you are studying Chinese, the goal was to become a country that was characterized by two Chinese characters, fu, meaning wealthy, and qiang, meaning powerful, with particular emphasis on military power. And that these remained the objectives, and one could argue are still the objectives in some ways, from the coming of the West around in the early late 1700s and the early 1800s down to the present time. As I've indicated, the search for economic wealth and military power was a response both to the perception of China's economic and military backwardness relative to both the West and somewhat later, to Japan, but also to the incursions against Chinese sovereignty by a host of foreign governments, ultimately also including Japan, who were seeking variously colonies, leased territories, open ports, and spheres of influence along the Chinese coast and up Chinese rivers into the interior of China. In other words, the motivation of self-strengthening, as the search for wealth and power was also called, was essentially defensive, and it was rooted in genuine security concerns. And what I want to suggest today is that China has very largely achieved wealth and power. Finally, after more than 100 years, that struggle, that goal has been largely successful. Although, as I'll also suggest, the sustainability of some of those achievements can still be called into questions. And as that goal has been achieved, so too does it appear that the goal or the motivation, the purpose of achieving wealth and power is also changing. And it's moving beyond these very understandable and traditional security concerns onto something else. And I'm not going to give away the conclusion of my talk just yet, but I think when we get to it, you'll see how I believe that security is being redefined, but China is not only moving beyond the search for wealth and power, but also beyond the search for defensive security into something somewhat more ambitious. Now, China's struggle for wealth and power was largely ineffective through the 1800s because of the instability inside China itself. It was a period of internal rebellion, civil war, in fact the bloodiest civil war in history, the Taiping Rebellion, and then the Communist Revolution. And it was not until 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party established nationwide power, created the People's Republic of China, whose capital was in Beijing, and Mao Zedong announced that the Chinese people had stood up. It was only then that China could move beyond the very preliminary and spotty successes of the nationalist government, its predecessor, and to begin to achieve some preliminary results in this long-standing quest for wealth and power. Those results were preliminary. The Maoist era did see the creation of a basic, if very inefficient, industrial infrastructure, modeled largely after the capital-intensive industry and the planned economy of the Soviet Union, but with some distinctive Maoist components, especially with regard to agriculture and the countryside. And as all of you also know, the Chinese did also gain a basic, if limited, nuclear deterrent, alongside a very labor-intensive, manpower-intensive, and technologically non-sophisticated conventional military force. So while the People's Republic of China did achieve some preliminary accomplishments in its search for wealth and power during the Maoist era, it was only in the post-Mao era, and especially the era of Deng Xiaoping, which began with the initiation of reform at the end of the 1970s, 1978 in particular. It was only then that China was able to achieve rapid and sustained economic growth, and along with that, the money and the technological capability to support military modernization. And so China has achieved, since the late 1970s, very spectacular success with regard to achieving the goal of becoming a wealthy, a prosperous nation. Some call it the Chinese miracle. I'm not sure I would use that term. To me, a miracle is something that cannot be explained other than by the invocation of something supernatural, something indeed miraculous. And China did not succeed because it somehow violated or was an exception to what we know about economic development. It succeeded because it mastered the rules of economic development and did so far more effectively and in a far longer and more sustained way than any other nation before China's own experience. Such that China's GDP is now the second largest in the world after the United States. China holds the largest foreign exchange reserves in the world at about $3.3 trillion. As of 2012, it had achieved per capita GDP in purchasing power parity terms of about $8,500, not in the very top ranks, but in the group that the World Bank calls upper middle income countries, with GDPs per capita ranging between $4,000 and $12,500. So right in the middle of that upper middle group. And just to give you some sense of where that places China, it's roughly on a par with countries like Brazil, like Russia, and countries like India and Ukraine. So some of the other countries that you'll be touching on in the speaker series are also upper middle income countries and are about the same place in terms of per capita income as China is. The one big difference about China is you have to multiply per capita income by a very, very large population, which is why China is only in the middle with regard to per capita GDP, but is number 2 in the world and will soon probably become number 1 as a result of multiplying that per capita income by a very, very large population. This economic power is also giving China what I call acquisitive power. This is the power to acquire using its economic resources, to basically buy things using that large pool of foreign exchange reserves. As we all know, just from reading the papers, even casually, China is using its foreign exchange reserves to acquire resources abroad, to acquire petroleum, to acquire increasingly agricultural products, to acquire other metals and minerals, is also acquiring, and has for some time, acquiring technology and capital goods from abroad, but even more importantly is now acquiring companies, is making strategic investments, not just in resources, but in manufacturing companies, in companies that are engaged in advanced research and development, the companies that produce those resources, produce that technology, and make the designs that can create even more productive technological capacity. Another kind of power that is related to China's economic success is what I call China's sticky power. China's sticky power. I like to distinguish more different kinds of power than simply hard and soft. And I think that most of you have heard or read about Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard and his concept of soft power. I'll be coming back to that, in fact, in a minute. But hard power and soft power, I think, conflate too many different kinds of things. So I'm going to be talking not just about economic power and not just about military power, but also about several other kinds of power, starting with sticky power. This is the ability to use economic resources, not just to acquire, but to attract. And I think that it needs to be distinguished in some important ways from another kind of attractive power, which is what is usually called soft power, which is more cultural, more ideological, perhaps. But sticky power, the ability to attract because of economic success, attract people who want to participate in China's economic growth, is, I think, the most obvious result of China's increasing economic power. For example, there is now a near universal perception that businesses of all kinds, ranging from, say, automobile manufacturing to institutions of higher education, including my own, and every other economic institution, anybody else who sells or makes or provides goods or services, that no business can afford not to be in China. And that is an enormously important kind of power. It basically says you have to be here with us. You have to be part of us, part of our economic success, or you will fall behind your competition. And as a concrete measure of this, China now competes with the United States as the world's top destination for attracting incoming foreign direct investment. Sometimes it's the United States, sometimes it's China. It goes year by year for various other reasons. But basically, China is now seen, has established the reputation as being the place where anybody who does anything with regard to business, the sale of goods or services or the production of goods or services, must be. There is the growing perception, and I see this around me, including in my own family, the perception that the opportunities for young people are the greatest in China, and that now China is the destination where many young people want to go after they're ready to join the workforce. It is not, I think, because they necessarily think that China is a particularly pleasant or enjoyable place to live. Some do, some don't. It depends on who they are and where they work. But a sense of opportunity, of economic opportunity, that attracts individual people as well as companies and investors. Increasingly, these opportunities are more for Chinese than for expatriates. That's an important change that's occurring as more and more Chinese are trained abroad. But that means that the brain drain of Chinese to go and stay abroad is beginning to ebb, and the reverse flow of Chinese scholars and students trained abroad back to China is beginning to increase. And this is another manifestation of China's sticky power. Yet another kind of power, and I just came up with this term the other day, so how long I'll stick with it, I'm not quite so sure, is what I'm calling Teflon power. And that is that there is a widespread perception also that business, the media, and the academy cannot afford to run the risk of somehow being excluded from or restricted in terms of their access to this dynamic Chinese economy by being too critical of Chinese leaders and Chinese government policy. And that's especially true in the business community. Some would say in the academic community. I tend to think that's an overrated danger. But there is plenty of concern that as the U.S. government tries to bring cases against China before the World Trade Organization, that it is difficult to find business leaders who are willing to testify, in effect, or to join the case, because of their concern that the cost of putting themselves very clearly in a position of demanding change in an open way through the WTO, for example, dispute resolution mechanism, may simply be too risky. So that is another kind of power. All of these, whether you call it acquisitive power, whether you call it sticky power, whether you call it Teflon power, all of these kinds of power, the ability to attract or the ability to deflect, are all related to this enormous Chinese economic success of the past several decades. Now, all this also reflects respect for China's growing hard economic power. And of all the kinds of economic power that I've talked about so far, this is the first category that I'm going to put along with military as hard power, the ability basically to coerce, the ability to put pressure, not to attract, not to deflect, but to coerce, to try to compel. And we see that China's economic power is producing that kind of economic coercive capacity as well. The Chinese government is willing to use import regulations, procurement contracts, various kinds of other internal business regulations, and its growing ability to give official development assistance overseas to reward and punish governments and businesses according to whether they take positions that are what the Chinese government would like them to take. Less obviously, the Chinese Party, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese government control, one way or another, state enterprises, which still are at the heart of the Chinese economy. And that gives the government in Beijing another set of levers in which they can exercise economic power in a harder form than simply attraction or acquisition. They are able to reward firms and countries that they like, and they are able to punish firms and governments that have done things that China does not like. So all of these first basket of kinds of power are the result directly of the Chinese economic so-called miracle, Chinese great economic success of the last several decades. Let me say a few words next about China's increasing military power. This is the Qiang part of the Fuqiang dichotomy, wealth and economic power, military power. Now, I'm not so naive to think that I can tell you in the Naval War College anything about China's military power, especially its naval power, that you don't know far better than I. So let me simply make a few obvious points about what China is doing. It is true that in the early years of the post-Mao reform, military modernization was put at the lowest rank with regard to the other three of what were called the four modernizations. Below agriculture, industry, and science and technology, this was the lowest priority. That did not mean that it had no priority at all. And what it also means is that as China has become more successful with its search for economic power, it has felt more comfortable in providing more and more resources to this goal of military modernization, such that you do not have a sense that there is any ranking any longer, certainly not one that puts military modernization at the bottom. China is interested, as a matter of national policy, of developing far more modernized armed forces than it had enjoyed during the Maoist period, let alone before. These include strategic nuclear forces that are capable now of reaching the United States as well as all neighboring countries surrounding China, conventional missile capabilities, in other words, with conventional warheads as well as nuclear warheads, a far more capable Air Force, including the development of fifth generation or stealth fighters, a blue water Navy with more capable ships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and other surface ships, submarines, And above all, and this is in deep keeping with China's historical strategic traditions, a variety of asymmetrical capabilities. Because even though China is becoming more and more powerful vis-a-vis other countries, and relatively more and more powerful vis-a-vis the United States as well, the Chinese still believe that they are not in a position of equaling American military power. And therefore, they have to think of ways of achieving a very traditional Chinese goal of how the weaker can defeat the stronger through strategy, through various kinds of asymmetrical capabilities and asymmetrical strategies. So to remind you of some of the asymmetrical capabilities that the Chinese are developing in order to, as they would think of it, as evening the playing field, reducing the imbalance militarily between China and the United States. These would include cyber warfare, something that is attracting increasing attention and concern here in the United States, and anti-satellite capabilities. So basically to make the enemy both blind and dumb, unable to communicate, unable to see, unable to monitor. Obviously in an era of informational warfare, this is a very important capability to have, and the Chinese know it. They also, and particularly concerned to our Navy, I know, developing anti-ship ballistic missiles. So not just the traditional anti-ship missiles and submarines and torpedoes and other kinds of more traditional surface and submarine warfare capabilities, but anti-ship ballistic missiles, which will be much more difficult to defend against. So the Chinese are not simply trying to match the United States weapon system for weapon system. They are trying to develop a different set of capabilities, matching in some areas, but putting, I think, equal attention on asymmetrical capabilities that can overcome, as they see it, the American superiority, while also keeping in mind that China at this point has no pretensions of being a global military power in the same way the United States does. So the United States has the problem of having global military responsibilities. The Chinese do not. And that means that their strategic problem is a bit more simple when they don't have to match the United States on a global basis, but only on a regional one. Now, this is not to say, I mentioned that the question of sustainability and the question of the utility of China's power is something that we need to look at a little more carefully. One of the areas of weakness for China militarily is, and this is of course a good thing, that China has lacked experience in combat operations since the Sino-Vietnamese War. So they do have a growing military arsenal with more sophisticated weapons, more asymmetrical capabilities, better trained professional soldiers, sailors, and airmen, but they have not been able to gain practical, real combat experience for many, many years now. Now, what are the results of all of this? Although the balance of power is hard to assess, and I'll leave it to Andy Marshall in the Pentagon and others who do net assessment professionally, I think it's fair to say as a simple conclusion that China's growing military power is already complicating American strategic thinking, particularly with regard to contingencies involving the Western Pacific. It's already making your jobs, our jobs, that much more difficult. However, at the same time, the flip side of that coin is that it is leading to counterbalancing by the United States and others, because others, including us, see China's capabilities increasing while its intentions, the purposes to which those capabilities might be put, are not clear. And so whether you call it a pivoting policy or a hedging policy, the United States and others, Japan, Australia, other countries in the region, are seeking some kind of soft counterbalance to China's increasing military power. This complicates China's calculations because its attempt to become stronger militarily is not going unnoticed and not going unresponded to by other countries on its periphery and in its neighborhood. Now, I mentioned that I would be talking first about the harder forms of power, especially the various kinds of economic power and now military power. But I want to say a few words about China's search for softer kinds of power as well. And again, I don't put in the category of soft power everything that's not military, which I think has been a analytic problem for many people who've talked about soft power. If it doesn't involve the ability to use military power for coercive purposes or economic power for coercive purposes, it's got to be soft power. There are these two binary categories, hard and soft. And you'll see, you've seen, I see a lot of different kinds of power that lie between military power on the one hand and then various kinds of economic power and then soft power on the other. But let me finally turn to soft power. Because in recent years, China has also sought to develop several forms of soft power alongside military power, sticky power, Teflon power, and acquisitive power, the other forms of economic power. What are some of the examples of this? They'll be well known to all of you. First of all, one of the most familiar kinds of soft power, the development of cultural and educational exchange programs with other countries around the world, in Asia in particular, but also with Europe and the United States. These would be the Confucius Institutes that are being established in a number of universities in the U.S. and other parts of the world, programs for study abroad in China. The creation of international broadcasting services, both radio and cable television, so that now you can, on most cable or many cable networks around the world, not yet in Charlottesville, Virginia, I admit, but in other places and in many four-star hotels around the world, you can see CCTV 9 or CCTV 4, the various international broadcasting channels of China, seen as the equivalent of CNN, in both English and in Mandarin Chinese, as a way of getting both information about China, about life in China, China's economic and cultural situation, as well as China's views of the world, its take on the news, out to the rest of the world. China has sought to host, and has hosted successfully a number of major events that are traditionally seen as coming out parties for emerging powers. These have included the Asian Games and, of course, the Beijing Olympics, and conducted those with enormous expenditure, enormous pomp, enormously impressive opening ceremonies, as well as impressive performance by Chinese athletes in those international sporting events. The Chinese have increasingly advocated, stood up for international norms. It is trying to embed its rise in a set of values. But it's interesting to pause for a moment and think about the values that China is trying to claim that it stands for. These are what I call modern values. And let me explain that by that I mean in contrast to postmodern values. China is perhaps one of the classic remaining Westphalian states that believes in the idea the international system is based on the principle that nation states are the core elements and that the values, the norms of territorial integrity and national sovereignty are near absolute. So that China is very skeptical about norms that are more postmodern, that talk about the infringements upon the sovereignty of nation states by international institutions, or that legitimize various kinds of intervention, even humanitarian intervention, in the internal affairs of other states without the express consent of the governments of those states. So China does stand for values, but the problem from the American perspective is that these are a set of values that are rooted in the 17th century rather than the 21st, that they are not adequate, we think, to deal with some of the problems of the modern world, or as I'm calling it, the postmodern world. The Chinese would counter that there is no widespread consensus on the appropriateness of these postmodern norms, and that therefore China is in that sense a conservative power. It is not the radical power. It is not the anti-status quo power. The United States is the anti-status quo power. China is defending norms that it believes are the status quo and are still held dear and are promulgated and supported by the majority of countries in the world, except for a small number of powerful and wealthy ones. China has also, as a final form of soft power that I will mention, it has encouraged discussion of, though it has been cautious not to go too far towards officially sponsoring, the idea of a distinctive Chinese model of economic development that many people, again, not Chinese, but many others outside China, call the Beijing Consensus. In contrast to what was also still known as the Washington Consensus, as embodied in institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and to some degree USAID. This is a model that emphasizes step-by-step reform rather than big bang change, a continuing role for government regulation of the economy rather than thoroughgoing and complete liberalization. And also is one that favors continued non-democratic political institutions, call them authoritarian if you will, as a way of dealing with some of the tensions that contradictions and opposition that might otherwise block the successful movement towards economic reform. And basically the Chinese are saying that this is not the only way to do things, this Washington Consensus. The Beijing Consensus has worked for China, even though they are making no claims yet of its universality. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. What claims are they making with regard to the Beijing Consensus? Now, why soft power? Why does this matter to the Chinese? Because the Chinese have put a lot of emphasis on this, as well as the more traditional and somewhat harder forms of power, military power and economic power. Chinese leaders have, or Chinese analysts, scholars anyway, have really looked at this question quite carefully. They spend a lot of time analyzing the modern international system and recent diplomatic history. And one of the interesting questions that they have asked themselves is, why has the United States, generally speaking, not mobilized or seen mobilizing a counterweight to itself? Why has the United States been able to maintain a position of being what many scholars would call the hegemonic power in the post-World War II situation? Why has there not been a significant counterbalance against it? And the Chinese have concluded that the United States has soft power, that the United States is able to legitimize its harder forms of power. And I think that is the most important reason why the Chinese want soft power, is that it will make the rise of other kinds of Chinese power more acceptable, it hopes. Because it knows that basically in international affairs, power tends to create countervailing power. It tends to evoke a balance because of the concern by other states that the rising power will somehow threaten their interests. Soft power is reassuring. It basically says, don't worry, we're good guys. We believe in norms, the same norms of international affairs that you do. We support the same international institutions that you do. We have the same objectives in international affairs that others do. And therefore, soft power is a way of legitimizing the development of harder forms of power. The Chinese are also using soft power to delegitimize actions and statements by others that challenge Chinese interests. And this is what I've called in some of my other writing the hard edge to soft power. It's the connection of hard power and soft power, the way in which soft power can either legitimize your own hard power or delegitimize the hard power of others. That is very important. It's not just that the Chinese want everybody to study Confucius and learn Chinese and appreciate contemporary Chinese art or the splendors of the Chinese past or how great Chinese food is, all of which are in some sense the traditional forms of soft power, or to study in Chinese institutions or have Americans work in China or have Chinese teachers come to the U.S. All of those are the more traditional form of cultural and educational exchange and influence. This is a link to the harder forms of power. And as I've said, it's to legitimize it when China develops it and to delegitimize the forms of the exercise and the development of hard power when the United States or other countries that are seen as unfriendly to China try to develop them. Now, how well has China done? I've given you a sense of my rough assessment of China's military power and its growth. What about China's soft power and its growth? I'm not sure that China has done a great job in legitimizing its own rise yet. I think that the problem is that China still gives the impression that it's all about China. And I think that that is why people had a less positive reaction to the Beijing Olympics than China would have liked. For China, this was not simply a great sporting event that Beijing had now the opportunity to host. And notice that technically in the Olympics, it's not the World Cup, it's the Olympics, that the host is not a country, it is a city. And certainly the emphasis in the Beijing Olympics was not on Beijing, it was on China. It was all about China. The world was supposed to use this to welcome and acknowledge the rise of China. And China has not, I think, yet been able to give the impression that it really cares for much other than its own interests, with the exception of these traditional Westphalian values of sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I think in terms of developing soft power, China, in that traditional sense, China has only achieved, maybe a B- or so in my grade book. Where it has done better is to delegitimize American power, and particularly with regard to the American development model. The Chinese have been very clever in not making universal claims for the Beijing consensus, but by simultaneously then saying that the United States should not be making universal claims for the Washington consensus, because guess what? It doesn't seem to be working universally, including in its own author's backyard. In other words, it's not working that well in the United States. It's not working in parts of the world that have adopted it. So the Chinese, I think, have been better at delegitimizing American power than legitimizing their own. A few comments before I turn to the question of the changing nature of Chinese goals. Let me say a few words about the sustainability of these kinds of power, harder and softer. First, economic power. It is clear that the Chinese have done extraordinarily well in maintaining and sustaining high rates of economic growth ever since the late 1970s. Basically, high single-digit average growth rates per year in a sustained way. Now, one can quibble about the statistics, and there's often a reason to do so. But I don't think anybody now will gainsay the enormous success that China has had in growing its economy. But there are longer-term challenges to sustaining that economic growth. One aspect of China's strategy has been to accumulate foreign exchange reserves. And as I said, it has by far the largest foreign exchange holdings in the world. This was, like so many aspects of Chinese power development strategy, essentially defensive. Like many other Asian countries, especially after the Asian financial crisis, there was a sense that you needed to have large foreign exchange reserves to protect yourself against some kind of economic meltdown at home. And that those countries that did not have reserves could not cushion themselves from that kind of a meltdown or a more global financial crisis. But beyond a certain point, you begin to ask the question of whether the continued accumulation of large foreign exchange reserves, whether it may begin to have more costs than benefits. Of course, it begins to give you the power not just to defend yourself against crisis, but to acquire. But beyond a certain point, your acquisitive capacity also begins to be saturated. And you begin to do what the Japanese did in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, of acquiring assets at inflated prices that you don't really have much need for or don't need to have much to do with. In particular, the continued, without getting into the economics of it, happy to do that in the Q&A, but the acquisition of foreign exchange, basically by buying it from Chinese who helped the country generate this surplus on its trade account, the acquisition of these foreign exchange reserves is inherently inflationary. It involves pumping Chinese currency into the Chinese economy to buy US dollars from Chinese exporters. And while the inflationary pressures have been managed successfully so far, there are signs that inflation is just below the surface, is beginning to rear its ugly head in a country that historically has been very nervous about inflation because of its experience, especially in the 1940s. Beyond these inflationary pressures, there's also the question of China's demographics. We are seeing a shrinking workforce, or at least a workforce that is stopping growth as a result of the one-child per couple policy, and then by the normal situation where middle-class Chinese no longer need or want to have lots of kids for their future security. So the growth rate of the population is slowing, the workforce is going to level off and shrink, and slower growth in other parts of the world are all going to bring the sustainability of an export-led model of growth based on low labor costs into very, very serious question. The Chinese will not be able to sustain it for both internal and external reasons, I believe. Also, there's a very weak banking system in China with a significant portfolio of low-performing loans or non-performing loans as a result of a continued emphasis on investment as the engine of the Chinese economy, and that may not be sustainable as well. In other words, China's growth has been based basically on two parts of GDP, exports and investment, not on domestic consumption, or even for that matter, on domestic government spending, other than government spending taking the form of government investment. And there are questions about the sustainability of all of those components of GDP growth. China has to switch, as Chinese leaders are the first to say, from an export-oriented or investment-oriented growth model to a domestic consumption model. And all of that, in turn, requires that China undertake another wave of economic reforms. And the big question that we'll be asking at the forthcoming Party Congress is whether not whether the new leadership wants to do it, but whether they will have the authority and the support to do it. Because there are very powerful vested interests now that basically benefit from the continuation of the status quo. And that's not surprising. It happens in almost every country. So can China undertake a second wave of reform? And can it innovate technologically as well as copy and adapt the technology of others? If not, if it cannot do these things, the attractiveness of China's development model, which is so much a part and parcel of its sticky power, its Teflon power, and its acquisitive power, as well as the fundamental support for the Chinese military modernization program, will begin to erode. It will not collapse, but the growth of that power will begin to slow. And so, as I've just implied, the military power, the growth of China's military power, can also be questioned with regard to its sustainability. That will depend on both the growth and the innovative capacity of the Chinese economy, and the evolution of the Chinese domestic situation, both economically and politically. And the legitimacy of China's, or the acceptability of China's growth in military power will depend on the ability of China to maintain and develop its soft power. And with regard to soft power, I think the key here will be the perception of whether China is honoring or violating international norms of and institutions, honoring or violating its obligations with regard to its membership in the WTO and other international obligations with regard to its behavior, especially on its periphery. But above all, will it be willing to begin to provide international public goods? In other words, to exercise true leadership. The best definition of leadership, or one of them that I've ever heard, is basically it's not about you. If it's all about you, it's not leadership. Leaders basically are concerned about followers, they're concerned about their folks, their people, or they're concerned about a broader purpose. And I think that that will be the key challenge for China in continuing to develop its soft power. And I see this as a considerable vulnerability, frankly. Let me conclude by talking about how China's success, although with some question marks, its success in developing these various kinds of power, harder and softer, may begin to transform Chinese goals. the purpose for which these, what the Chinese call comprehensive national power, the elements of comprehensive national power, have been acquired. As I said originally, and for very good reason, Chinese sought wealth and power because they had very real security concerns. They were doing so for essentially defensive reasons. But those traditional security concerns are no longer as pressing as they were in the 19th century. Given China's growing military power and simply the size of China, there are few, if any, external threats to Chinese security. China does not have to worry about being invaded any longer by Russians or Japanese or Americans or any other country or military on the periphery of China. However, there are other kinds of security concerns that are rising, so a new form of security challenge for China, and then I will suggest some other non-security goals as well. In terms of the new types of security concerns, let me simply tick off a few. First is internal security. China remains concerned about what it regards as internal threats, threats to its own integrity as a nation state, and that's particularly the concerns that come from problems in minority areas, most particularly with regard to Tibet, and also other parts of China like Taiwan that show signs of seeking greater or sustained autonomy or even independence from the rest of China. So China does see that it has security concerns, not like it was in the old days of major powers trying to lop off pieces of Chinese territory or to seek through force privilege inside China, economic or political, but as internal threats. And equally important is the concern about the ability and desire of external powers to manipulate those threats. In other words, that China is vulnerable not just to those threats per se, but to the attempts of others, especially the United States, to manipulate those sources of Chinese insecurity and potential weakness. That has a very long history in China and is a familiar problem, but still no less worrying for being so. In addition, Chinese are looking, even as they uphold what I've called the traditional view of the norms of the international system, they're also increasingly aware of the postmodern threats to security, summarized by some work that's done in Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden in particular, societal security, which refers not only to these questions of internal instability and division, but external concerns, resource security, energy security, food security, water security, climate security, health security. China knows that it is vulnerable to all of these kinds of problems and slowly is devoting more and more attention to them, although I think not yet to the same level that is familiar in some Western countries, particularly in Europe and the United States. So China remains concerned about security, as it always has, with some new glosses on it. Some aspects of security are becoming less challenging, others are becoming increasingly important. But I think China is basically beginning to move beyond not only its search for wealth and power, but also beyond a concern with security to another couple of goals. I don't think that China's goal yet, and perhaps it never will be, is dominance in Asia, becoming the hegemonic power in Asia. It's a very hard region to dominate. If you think of it broadly speaking as a group of very powerful rising countries in addition to China, China is there, Japan is there, Russia is there, the Southeast Asian nations are there, the United States is there strategically, if not geographically. It would take a huge failure on the part of a lot of other countries to make it easy for China to dominate the region. So I don't believe that dominance is China's goal at this point. Rather, it is two related goals, acceptance and deference. And those are, I think, significantly different from more traditional dominance. Acceptance, I think, refers to China's growing, increasingly explicit demand that the United States accept it as a legitimate major power, both in terms of the Asia-Pacific region and globally. That China should have a place at the table and should have a voice on every major issue. not to decide, not necessarily to veto, but it should be accepted as a major player with the right to speak and the right to be listened to. This demand reflects Chinese perceptions that the United States in some ways is trying to block China's rise. And if you operationally mean what does it mean to accept, it means stop doing things that the Chinese think are blocking China's rise. In terms of, for example, restricting China's investment in strategic investments in the United States, stop trying to block China's participation in various international economic arrangements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, accept us as a party that has the right for a place at the table and a voice in every major institution and every major issue. The second and parallel goal that I see rising in Chinese thinking is what I call the goal of deference. China also increasingly demands that others, including the United States, to defer to what China defines as its core interests. This may be a term that some of you who study China have seen is used more and more frequently in Chinese statements and writings about international affairs. Core interests, often linked to the idea of red lines, those actions by others that would challenge or violate China's core interests. And basically the idea is that every major power has the ability and the right to define its core interests and then to basically demand that others accept those, defer to those core interests as well. China sees the United States as trying to encourage smaller Asian nations, including Taiwan, to defy rather than to defer to China's core interests, especially with regard to its territorial claims. So we see that in particular now with regard to the Sino-Japanese dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyutai Islands, where a standard Chinese interpretation now is that the United States is encouraging Japan to defy China, rather than to accept and acknowledge China's territorial claims and then negotiate some kind of a deal, but based on that acceptance. So basically, what China is now increasingly demanding is not just security, but acceptance of its rising power status and deference to China's core interests by the United States and by others. Now, Chinese analysts increasingly then talk of what they call a grand bargain between China and the United States. That basically would be the contours of this arrangement where we accept and they and others, including us, defer, but China does not demand a dominant or exclusive role in Asia. The details of what this grand bargain would mean more concretely are not clear because the Chinese government has not yet officially taken up this idea. Just as it has not officially taken up the idea of the Beijing consensus. And the Chinese analysts who write about this grand bargain or speak about it are not necessarily of one mind on what it would look like either. But I think the essential notion of a grand bargain has some combination of the following elements. First, that the United States will respect what China defines as its core international interests, including its right to chart its own path of development. Basically, the Chinese are saying, stop beating up on us about issues like human rights and models of development. That basically, stop criticizing us. We will take our own path. It will not be what you expect or what you might prefer, but we will go our own way. Call it the Beijing consensus, if you were. Second, the United States will accept, even welcome, China's rise as a new great power. That is the acceptance element. Acknowledge its leading role, not necessarily its dominance, but its leading role in Asia, with the boundaries of what Chinese now mean by that region as still uncertain as well. Welcome its growing role in international regimes and institutions. In other words, the United States will join others in a policy of acceptance and deference. In other words, accept those goals that are becoming increasingly important to the Chinese. In turn, this is a bargain, in turn, China will respect America's leadership role generally, globally, and in other regions than Asia. so that we accept you there, but you have to accept us here. We will encourage others to defer to your core interests over there. You will encourage others to defer to our core interests over here. Some Chinese military folks in conversations with Americans have talked about some kind of line down the middle of the Pacific, or some the boundary of the Western Pacific. Again, these boundaries are very unclear so far, but that is all part of the idea that we will have, to use the old traditional terms, our sphere of influence, and you will accept it, and we will give you yours, and we will accept it. So the question is the Chinese government beginning to move towards that kind of proposal to the United States? What are the details? Will it be acceptable to the United States, this combination of we accept and defer, they also accept and defer? And if it is not acceptable to the United States, what alternative will be acceptable to China? I'll stop there and hope I provoked you enough to have some good, I know I have, some good questions and discussion until Terry says that it's time for us to move on to other things. Thank you all very much.
Any questions?
Yep, please.
We are taught to always look for the counter-argument here.
Good.
What if China is not a state? What if it's an empire? What if it's the last empire? What if it's brittle, not solid, like you've described? Could it collapse like the Soviet Union did?
It could, excepting I think there's a big difference between, at least so far, one is admittedly not necessarily enduring characteristic, but the other is. China is much more successful economically than the Soviet Union. And that is a very important element that gives China, I think, greater endurance. The other is that so much of the collapse of the Soviet Union was ethnically determined. China is, despite its problems in a number of minority areas, I singled out Tibet, you could look at some places like Inner Mongolia, add a few to that list, but China is far more, well, we put it the other way around, far less ethnically heterogeneous than the former Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was really, in that sense, an empire. It also had the problem of its, what we used to call the satellite states. And of course, that's where things began to unravel first with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. China does not have anything quite that comparable. So I would say that China is a country, the Chinese themselves talk about the idea of sort of the core China. In Chinese, it's 中国本部, the kind of the core part of China. And again, all these boundaries depends on who you ask. And then there is sort of what we now call Greater China, the China around the core. And it's correct to say that some of those peripheral areas pose problems at times, but not to the same degree as existed for the former Soviet Union. The economy is doing quite well still. I think the challenge will be for the new leadership to really pick up the burden of further economic and also political reform. If they can't do that, then let's get together in about 10 years, 5 or 10 years, and see where they are going, take another look at it. China is always less stable than it appears on the surface. That is one rule, I think, of China watching. But to say that it's less stable than it appears does not mean that it is on the verge of collapse. So I think China will have bumps in the road, up and downs. I don't see its collapse as being imminent, but we have to keep looking at the factors that promote this instability, and I could reserve the right to change my assessment if things begin to head south. Yes?
Yeah, thanks very much for the very thought-provoking lecture. I think the distinction you drew between dominance and maybe this acceptance deference framework is really interesting, and that deserves a lot of reflection in here and other places. Two quick questions. One, maybe the obvious question is, can you offer some of your thoughts on Xi Jinping? I mean, we've heard kind of two different Xi Jinpings described. The young man who came to Iowa and looked at American agriculture, and then I think recently in the New York Times, is it more, possibly much more assertive than Hu Jintao? That's one question. The other is, and here just to if could you give us a little more of your thought on these kind of island or reef situations in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, where we in this room, day to day, we're interfacing with the U.S. Navy, talking about the movement of ships and so forth. I mean, how would you advise Washington to act in these various situations where China seems to be not overtly aggressive, but certainly pushing the boundary as hard as it can?
Yes, yes. Well, let me take thank you for I'm glad you found the idea of deference useful. I think one question is, and this is a difference among scholars of China, is to how the extent to which deferring to China in a kind of more local grand bargain would be natural or acceptable to other countries around its periphery. There are some scholars, especially Chinese diplomatic historians, who believe that is the norm. That was the norm for China historically. Others deferred to China. They literally kowtowed to China. Their emissaries went to Beijing and performed the kowtow, and China pretty much left them alone. So deference in exchange for autonomy. And therefore, those scholars argue this should be quite easy and comfortable for the rest of the region. I see absolutely no evidence that that's true today. I think the rest of the region does not want to, in a sense, to accept that degree of dominance by China. And I think that that's a very important part of the dynamic. I'm glad that you found those points that I made to be interesting. With regard to Xi Jinping, I don't know. I don't think any of us really knows for sure. But one thing we do know is that every leader of China, since Mao, including Deng Xiaoping himself, but even more the people who followed Deng Xiaoping, every leader of China is less powerful than his predecessor. And therefore, to some degree, I'm not sure it matters what Xi Jinping stands for, even if I could tell you what I thought he did. I mean, you look, for example, at Wen Jiabao, the current prime minister, accused of incredible family corruption, which is an interesting problem, and we can speculate about why that comes up all of a sudden. But here is a man who we do have evidence has basically been calling for political reform increasingly urgently for the last several years, and has gotten no traction at all. And I think that basically this is now the same kind of question you can ask about any complex, relatively institutionalized political system. How much do individual leaders matter? So I am not, even if Xi Jinping were the kind of leader who wanted this more dramatic form of economic and political reform that I think is going to be increasingly necessary, I'm not sure that they will have the power to be able to implement it. Unless there is much greater consensus within the Chinese Communist Party that it is necessary. So, and maybe that is a grounds for pessimism, that the Chinese system may be just as gridlocked as many of us think our own political system is. And in fact, I was, not getting too political here, we have the same problem with Mitt Romney. What does he stand for? Is he a reformer? Is he a moderate? Is he conservative? Is he what? He's responding to a very complicated political process. He's changed roles over time. And we could say that even if we had a good fix on him, how much would that tell us about where the United States will go if he is elected on Tuesday? Not obviously huge differences, but an underlying similarity, I think. So that would be my answer to that question. Your second question, or your third comment/question, was about the islands. And basically here, of course, there are several issues. One is the Chinese claims to these rocks, most of which are uninhabitable unless you build concrete structures on top of them. And when we talk about the law of the sea, basically the law of the sea, as I understand it, all is an extension of the law of the land. If you know who owns the land, then you can start projecting out from it various territorial sea limits, exclusive economic zones, and so forth. And the problem is that there is no consensus on who owns which of these little rocks and shoals. Nor is there a consensus on the derivative question of what are the rights of a country that can convincingly claim an exclusive economic zone based on the territorial claims. what does that say about the ability of other nations to enjoy freedom of movement for its naval vessels? The Chinese say one thing, we say another. And apparently the law of the sea is not definitive on that point, even if the United States had ratified it, which we have not done, of course. So I don't have any solutions except to say that, so this is a talk that I just gave up in Washington about trust and mistrust in U.S.-China relations. Most of the solutions that we come up with won't work because they don't address the underlying question. So the idea is, well, let's have joint development. Well, that sounds plausible, excepting that, at least so far, the Chinese have basically said, we'll be happy to have joint development as long as you accept our territorial claim. Then we can talk about how to divide up whatever resources are under those in the seabed. So I think that the underlying issue of sovereignty for a nation that still holds the principle of sovereignty to be one of the most fundamental and is still reacting to incursions on its sovereignty throughout the 19th century, and it would say well into the 20th, this is a very knotty problem. And I have no solution, because that, as we all know, is probably the most difficult question in international affairs to resolve. Yes, ma'am.
Harry, you've been watching China for longer than most of us, so let me ask you this.
Too long.
Do you expect China will ever be transparent in its intentions? You mentioned that this is a core problem. Is this sort of the U.S. and others, this is an effort to try and keep pushing that, and if it's never to be, then maybe we should acknowledge it and move on. A related question, if I may, the idea of soft power, you mentioned, we understand well what China's against, and these 18th, 19th century norms and so on. But we don't understand well what they're for.
Yes,
and
exactly.
You implied this, that what their values are, and it seems to some extent the harder they try to develop soft power, the more problems they create. For instance, they're attracting a lot of Hollywood investment right now, because that economic sticky power you mentioned, a lot of investment opportunities, lower costs, all that. But of course, then it raises, on the other hand, all the political issues, social, cultural issues, freedom of the press and expression and all that. So we've seen a little bit of that, but I expect we'll see a lot more as James Cameron and others develop their big studios in China. So in a related way, do they have a set, if you will, intention? Do they know what the Chinese values are beyond Confucius Institutes? It seems to me there's a big hole there that they, because of their incremental approach to political reform, have not been willing to go there yet, at least not at a national level. And that, do you see that as a big constraint, both for China and for this, how do we know what China intends as its military and other powers are growing?
Right. The first question about transparency is very interesting, and I think that one of the big problems is the Chinese emphasis on asymmetrical strategies. And one of the most important elements of asymmetry is not being transparent. Basically, if you look at asymmetry as opposed to being a fancy word and get down to the core problem that it's meant to address, how do the weak defeat the strong through strategy, basically the last thing the weak want to do is to be transparent. And the Chinese have been quite clear on this and quite explicit. The reason that the Americans want to be transparent is, first of all, by being transparent themselves, they want to intimidate China. Look how strong we are. We're transparent. See how strong we are? So you better behave. And you want us to be transparent so that we will lose the benefit of deception and secrecy. That is one way of trying to level that playing field. So I think that alongside the call for continuous dialogue, I just was reading something this morning, an article in Survival, about the failure of the strategic economic dialogue, these constant, let's have dialogue, let's build mutual confidence. Why hasn't it worked? Because this is not addressing the core problem of the cause of mistrust. Transparency is not going to remedy it either, and in fact the Chinese will be very suspicious about it. The kinds of reassurances that they would be likely to give, bland reassurances, will not be satisfying. So I think that, frankly, we've tried it. It, as I said, used to say in the New York City taxi cabs, ask for a receipt, can't hurt, could help. I suppose it can't hurt, but I don't put any great stock in it. So sorry, I don't think transparency is the solution either. Finally, I think you put your finger on what I see as China's soft power problem. What does China stand for other than itself? And I don't see anything yet. Now, that could be basically part of an evolutionary process of a major power rising to prominence from a period where it had to just care about itself. It was weak. It had to become stronger. It had to defend itself. This is nothing sort of pathological about this. But the problem is that China's soft power strategy, which I would call as bland reassurances, we will not threaten anybody, to basically tone deaf talk about, my favorite is win-win relationships. Anybody who's studied international affairs or even interpersonal psychology knows that a relationship is not going to be acceptable to both parties simply because it's positive sum. Here's a deal for you. Let's have a relationship. I'll win 200 and you'll win 5. That's win-win, right? You're winning more. I happen to be winning far more than you, but hey, it's win-win. So win-win without attention to the question of relative gains is not going to work, except for, we actually have tried this in experiments in college classrooms, unless people are trained in neoclassical economic theory, who basically say, as long as I get more than I would otherwise, that's great. Most real-world people are more concerned about who wins more. So that doesn't work. The demands for trust. You don't trust me? That's because you're biased against me. So clear up your bias. Stop Cold War thinking and trust me. No, you can't earn trust by demanding it. You only get it by, yes, earning it. So a lot of this, not just we with our sort of sense, well, let's sit down and talk and be transparent and reassure each other and build personal relationships. Can't hurt, could help. But I don't think that any of these strategies that either side is using is addressing the core problem of mistrust. And I think China's problem of soft power is exactly as you said, that until China begins to stand for something other than itself, I think in my talk I used the phrase, provide international public goods. The only area where I've seen them really doing so is the anti-piracy operations off the Somali coast. That's a good first step, and we should praise the Chinese for that. Obviously, China had direct interests. It wasn't entirely altruistic. They had their own concerns, but that's fine. That's where you start, common goals. But even there, the problem is, I've often been asked, what about common goals? Then immediately you get into the relative gains problems. Okay, we're working together. How much do you pay? How much do I pay to achieve these common goals? How much do you get? How much do I get? So I wish I could be more optimistic, but I see this as being a very knotty relationship. Positive side is we're horribly interdependent economically, and we have a situation of increasing mutual deterrence. So could be worse, but it could be a heck of a lot better. Yes?
Professor Harding, in the China community, regardless of if you're talking about academia, government, or even private sector, there's an off-site thesis that greater corruption will inevitably lead to instability for the Communist Party. Do you ascribe to those views? And my, I guess, a more specific question is, do we really think that greater corruption will indeed lead to the downfall of the party, especially with the party Congress coming up, and as you noted, these articles about Chinese leaders and their wealth are coming to light?
Yeah. I think that corruption and the even bigger problem of which it is a huge part, and that is growing inequality, could be a very, very serious problem. As can be abuse of power, as can basically the indifference to, well, to other kinds of public goods, pollution, environmental degradation. So you've got inequality, much of it the result of corruption, a sense that government officials are making decisions and approving projects that do actual harm for people in these areas. Yes, it could be. I think, though, that the question is, and this is something that actually also goes back in Chinese history, corruption was considered to be normal. The question was whether it was excessive or not. So you had this vague notion of this amount of corruption is okay, and this kind of corruption is not. And I'll tell you my favorite joke about corruption. It has nothing to do with China. but it's about has to do with Asia and dynamic countries in Southeast Asia. The story is that a finance minister from one country in the third world visits a country in Southeast Asia, is very impressed by what he sees about one of the new Tigers' success story. He's even more impressed when he goes out to his counterpart's country villa and is looking at this beautiful building and the beautiful scenery around and says, you know, your country is doing so well, how do you do it? And you're doing pretty well yourself, by the way, and how do you do it? And the Southeast Asian official says, see that bridge over there? Yeah, what about it? He said, 10%. Oh, he thinks about that. Now, the Southeast Asian then pays a return visit to his counterpart's country, and it's a mess. It really is not doing very well. But his counterpart also has this magnificent villa out in the countryside. And so, to be polite, the Southeast Asian says, well, your country is obviously making some progress, but you're doing really well. How do you do it? And he says, see that bridge over there? What bridge? 100%. And so there's corruption and there's corruption. And I think that as long as the, ordinary people do see a standard of living increasing and inequality within the bounds of what's normatively considered acceptable, that is sustainable. But you're right, that is one of the many things that we have to look at, along with the lack of political reform, a relatively non-transparent and democratic political system, the problem of demographic change, the problem of an economic growth model that's based on things like investment in exports and low labor costs that are not sustainable. These are the things we want to monitor over the middle and long term. So I hand over.
One more question.
One more question. Okay, who wants it? Hands. Okay, over here. So I saw you first.
Professor, you mentioned that you didn't think China would follow the Russian model of collapse. What about, this is not referring to collapse, but to the South Korean or the Taiwanese model of economic development leading to increasing demands for political pluralism and delegitimizing the Communist Party, the growth of the middle class in China.
Right.
Bringing about the fall of the authoritarian government. And then, are you worried about the danger of Han Chinese nationalism replacing communism as a legitimizing principle if this were to happen?
Well, let me take the second one first, because we already see it. It's not like, do I forecast it? We're already seeing it. And it basically started with the response of the party to the Tiananmen crisis of 1989 and the institution of these various kind of national education programs in colleges and universities in China, and just go on from there. So I think that nationalism is a very, very real danger I'd say for China as well as for the countries around China. That there are those powerful elements in China. Some of them are just in society, others are in the military, others are in the intellectual community who believe that others had better start deferring, to use the term, that accepting and deferring. And that those who don't need a little bit of not so friendly persuasion from time to time. I see this as a huge problem, and it was a way in the first instance of responding to a domestic problem, but it's also a sense that there is what some have called the iron law of international relations. As countries become more powerful, their objectives and their goals enlarge. And to some degree, we see it. I described it in relatively moderate terms as wanting acceptance and deference. Others would be more pessimistic than I. Believe that China will be driven by nationalism to seek more than that. I'll stick with my prediction for now. So that's the nationalism part. The other part, about the possibility of... Oh, that's right, Taiwan, yeah. Well, those are somewhat different models. The Taiwan experience, though it did have periods of violence and repression, it basically was evolutionary. And some of us, back in the period of the 1980s before Tiananmen, really hoped that China would follow the Taiwan model of basically starting with competitive elections at the lower level, having perhaps some kind of ability of not to have an opposition party, but to have some kind of quasi-organized alternative that would field candidates. The elections would go up to higher and higher levels. It hasn't happened. And I think the problem is that the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes. Frankly speaking, the fact that, although now it's been reversed, which may be more reassuring, that in both South Korea and in Taiwan, the ruling party that was forced to open up immediately lost the next election and lost the presidency. That's not too encouraging to people who are really asking, again, what's in it for me? Taiwan is a hopeful model, being ethnically Chinese, but it also indicates that wealth, Taiwan was, at least until recently, did not have the same inequality that you have in China. I think that right now a lot of Chinese middle class are scared to death of what would happen if large numbers of poor people got the vote. Fear of populism, which of course is always a recipe, has historically been a recipe for fascism in certain countries in Europe. There could be an equivalent elsewhere as well. So I think that one of the drivers in China will be the rise of a middle class that wants more influence, wants more predictability, wants better rule of law, wants more transparency on the part of government. But whether there will be, that will be the dominant driver as opposed to some other drivers that will go run up against it, including the greater complexity of China, the greater fear that liberalization cannot be controlled. I am not, again, I'm not pessimistic, but I'm not optimistic. We're going to be in for an interesting time in China for the next couple of decades.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Hurley.
Thanks, Charlie.